Welcome to Guardians of the Directory, the K-12 podcast dedicated to all things Active Directory management, security, and recovery. I'm Craig Birch, your host, identity security enthusiast, and principal security engineer, with over 2 decades of industry experience architecting and securing Microsoft solutions. Well, enough about me. Let's focus on today's discussion. But before we dive into today's topic, make sure you catch our last episode, Active Directory Recovery, post-ransomware, where we had Chad Nichols who walked us through his real-life experience recovering after a ransomware event. Today we're shifting our focus to a critical and timely issue, the surge of ransomware and cyber attacks targeting K-12 education. Schools are increasingly in the crosshairs of cyber criminals, leading to significant disruptions. To shed some light on this topic, we're joined by Jason, an IT expert with over 17 years of experience in securing K-12 school districts. Jason, welcome to the show.
Oh, Craig, thanks for having me.
Jason, before we get started, can you give us a little more insight into who you are and some of your experiences?
Sure. I started in K-12 education as a technician in about 2004, working full-time. Since then, I've also done a bit of consulting. So I've consulted for private schools of various stages, anywhere from K-8, some preschool institutions, K-12, some higher education. So I've been around the education district a lot. You might hear me throw out words like campus, things like that. It's just part of what I do.
Awesome. So, Jason, we've seen a noticeable increase in cyber attacks on schools. What makes them such a vulnerable target?
It's real interesting. I like to say that IT in education is like a crucible. It's very difficult to work with. You've got constraints that are unlike any other IT environment. For example, every single kid deserves an education and are required to get that education by law, which means every single kid is required to have access to your system. Now, some of those kids are quite intelligent and they have infinite time on their hands and are known bad actors. So I don't know of any other environment where you have to support known bad actors. You've also got lack of budgets, legacy personnel layout, where IT is kind of an afterthought in many cases. IT is seen as an expense, not something that needs to be done up front. So it's real interesting supporting students. A good percentage of the students can't read. Anybody from PK to, hopefully by 3rd grade they've got it figured out. But a good chunk of those kids are not expected to read, which means you can't give them complicated passwords. You can't give them written instructions. Now, on the flip side of that, it's really joyful to be able to give a kid a device and then watch them learn on it. It's incredibly rewarding. So I've been able to spend a little bit of time in the classrooms and watch kids use the technology for their education. It's been quite nice. That's what kept me in it for so long. But cyber criminals are out for money. That's the long and the short. And they'll target anybody where they think they can score an easy win. So understaffed educational environments that are forced to compromise security in order to support their users, the students, their staff. They're just easy picking is the long and short of it. And I think that's why we see a jump in attacks on them. They can, is the short of it.
That's some good insight. Is there anything particularly in the school data that makes them more target rich though? You mentioned obviously there's challenges around the population and even insider threats, but is this data more valuable to an attacker?
That's a good question. The information that you usually get out of a school system is out of their student information system, SIS. For those that don't know, that's a little bit like an HR system, but it's got information about students. unlike an HR system, which typically contains contact information and maybe a little bit of personal information, an HR system typically doesn't have HIPAA-related items in it. So you may have students that have medical concerns. You may have students with special needs, which could also be medical. And that information is typically located in the SIS. So by having that information, the attacker can then use that as leverage for publicizing it. So rather than just publishing names, address, phone numbers, things like that, they're in the position to threaten leaking personal information and medical information. So it's almost like a hybrid between attacking a conventional business with HR data plus maybe hitting something like a hospital or a doctor's office. It's interesting.
So because of that additional data, you think that the attackers know that the school they wouldn't want this leaked because it's obviously going to bring a higher, I guess, degree of risk to the organization. And if we go even further, even the students or even the parents, depending on what information is leaked.
Exactly. It's the community. In general, you've got all children going to the same school district in that area, with exceptions obviously for private school kids, but even some of the private school information's in the local school district SIS, because ultimately you have to do state reporting. So a private school student may attend a private school, but they'll still have a presence in the SIS system of the local school district because of the state reporting structure. That obviously varies district to district, but it's pretty fair to say that all of the young people in a community are in this area or in this SIS or in something like that SIS. So the leverage an attacker has with that data is very high, and nobody wants it released.
Well, that's interesting. I didn't even think about that aspect, that private school information may also be hosted in a public school system like SIS, as you mentioned, which really the exposure is pretty great, because now we're talking not just public school information, but also private schools that could be impacted by a single breach, depending on what is breached. So when we're talking about breaches, can you highlight any recent examples of some cyber attacks that you're aware of?
Sure. I live in the Seattle area, and most recently there was a school district here called Skyline. They started school, and I believe it was their second or third day in the full day of school, and cyber attack shut them down entirely. So they were not present for, I think, a week. It's quite a long time, and during the beginning of the school year. Um, that hit, like I said, my community. I don't have any association with that school district. They just happen to be in the same area that I live, and my neighbors happen to be school teachers, several of them. It's a little surprising, actually. On my street, there's about 12 houses, and I think 3 of those houses are educators, and they all work for different school districts in the area. But one of them in particular knows that I'm in IT. He knows that I've got lots of experience in EDU. So he came over, and I've only talked to this person 5 or 6 times. They're good neighbors. We like each other, but he made it a point to come over and say, "Hey, my school district was hit with this, and I got this text message from my school alert system, which is often used for notifications about snow days or regular school notifications." And he says, "Hey, my school district just got hit with this, and they said don't come to school, and we'll get back to you." And I thought that was weird. So then me personally, I look at that and I say, well, that's awful. Why are they not going to school? Do they think this is some sort of a larger threat? Also, why do we have to cancel school for a cyber attack? So that was very interesting, very recent, and it impacted the beginning of their school day or the school year.
Why do you think they had to cancel school because of a cyber attack? Are they not able to teach the students or get the students on buses because of these systems are now offline? What does that impact look like?
So yeah, exactly. They obviously don't share everything. It's an open, active investigation. Now, what they did say that they're working with the FBI. They later came out and said that there was never a threat to student safety. So we can assume that it was some sort of a data breach. They also said that they had to re-image all of their computers and basically reset the passwords on every system they've ever had. Now, those are facts. After the fact, we can assume that it was a data breach, that it didn't impact anything like fire alarms or any sort of a security system on campus. We can assume that those weren't impacted based on what they shared later. But yeah, to your point, logistics could be heavily impacted if they could not manage their school busing system. That could have created a liability for them. So, for an example, if they were unable to operate buses due to a cyber attack, and then they held school anyway, they would be offering education to those who could get themselves to school, which then isn't fair. And there are laws against some of those things. I'm not a lawyer, a law expert, but I do know that there are laws related to providing those students education. And they could have technically been in violation if they weren't able to bring those kids to school. Now, aside from busing and logistics, it seemed like they probably didn't have a cyber attack plan. And the long and short is that when you are experiencing a cyber attack, you don't want to be thinking, what do I do next? You want to be just like any sort of disaster plan. The FEMA talks about this. Be prepared for earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, all of those things. You have a plan. You've already discussed that plan with your family. If you get separated, you have a meeting point. You've got things like batteries and foods and fuel all available. IT disasters are, they're not usually as life-threatening, but the response to any disaster is the same. You need to have a plan, and people need to know what the plan is, and the plan needs to be executed without thinking too much about it during that time. I imagine that their plan wasn't completely ironed out, if any. Otherwise, there would have been a more structured notification when the attack happened, when they had to tell people not to come to school. It would have been communicated more clearly, and it probably would have been a little bit less stressful for the people involved. So that's what I assume happened over there.
So you mentioned that you thought that this was more of a data breach, but you also mentioned that they had to re-image systems. So it sounds more and more like it was ransomware with data breach or data exfiltration tied to it. Do you have any details around that, or is that something that we can infer because they had to re-image systems?
It's an inference. So they have publicly stated that they had to re-image their devices and had to reset all passwords. They've made reference to the word network, but they didn't clearly say whether their physical network was compromised too. For example, if they've got network software running through Cisco or Ubiquiti or whatever, we don't know if that was accessed. But it's a non-technical way of them saying they got into our systems. But they did use the word network, so I don't know for sure if they got into their network, but they could have. And they've definitely at least caused enough concern that they have to assume breach, which, by the way, assume breach is one of the tenets of zero trust security. So in that regard, if they're not sure that they're clean, then they're responding correctly in that sense.
Absolutely. So besides that one school district, I'll even highlight another one that was probably even more recent. Even I'll say a couple of weeks ago, in Marysville, Ohio, there was the school district actually reported a cyber attack. Now I don't remember if they actually used the word ransomware, but it did disrupt services, and students were unable to attend school for a couple of days, I believe. So these are becoming more and more frequent by threat actors. And it's not always full-on ransomware, but there is some either service disruption or some kind of data exfiltration where they're trying to use that data as leverage to potentially come back to the schools and threaten, from a ransomware perspective. Or this could be the first start of the attack, right? So there could be a later phase of full-on ransomware later on, depending on what the schools find during those attacks. So that's very interesting. As like I said, this seems to be very common, and I read about it pretty much almost on a daily basis where schools are impacted. So when we look at schools being impacted, what are some of the typical attack methods used to infiltrate these school systems? Can you shed some insight there?
Sure. Remember, this is a unique population. So going back to the students, some of which who can't read, even the students that can read are not sophisticated computer users like you might find in a common business. These aren't people that are trained to look for threats exactly. Even common cybersecurity preparation, most businesses have some sort of a basic program that just says, here's what spam is, here's what phishing looks like, don't click on links. Students don't have that training. And frankly, it's just not part of their curriculum, and I'm not sure it should be. The students are there to learn school, the math, the science, the English, the history, those types of things. So when you take time out of regular curriculum, it can't be replaced. And that's something I wanted to touch on too. One of the reasons the cybercriminals target schools isn't just for the ease, it's because the price of curriculum is literally priceless. The cost. If a student misses a school day that was unaccounted for, such as during a cyber attack, you can't make that time up. And that's not the same as something like a snow day. At the beginning of the school year, schools that have exposure to weather such as snow or extreme weather events build those days into the school schedule. So in one case I know of, a school district has 180 days of educational time, and what they'll do is build between 183 or 186, whatever they feel is relevant, into the total school schedule, knowing that if they have a couple of days of snow, they're not actually losing one of those critical 180 days. When you're talking about a cyber incident, those days are not accounted for. They're not pre-prepared for. That is a lost curriculum day, which cannot be made up ever. So in that regard, the time given to a student can't be replaced at all. Now, why are they attacking schools? It goes, or how are they attacking schools? It goes back to that non-sophisticated computer user. I've seen phishing, traditional phishing, highly effective. I've seen password stuffing, highly effective, because you've got those students that are not going to have complex passwords. Data breaches, sometimes a third-party application, possibly a free application, could have had their own cybersecurity attack, and then those passwords leaked. Do you think a second grader has unique passwords on every website? Probably not. And some of that goes back into, teachers will use free or low cost, usually free applications online. And while those are intended to be secure, I've seen them sell advertising. And some of that advertising is infected by drive-by attacks, just because they know their audience. So you might be working on a legitimate website to study math or reading or whatever, and it may have an ad in the corner that usually sells crayons or something like that. And because the attackers know what that site is doing, they can slip in some drive-by malware. And then you're exposing that to, a non-sophisticated computer user that can be infected by it. So traditional attack methods that might be less successful at a business that operates full of adults who can all read and are probably exposed to some type of cybersecurity training are way more effective towards a student population.
So that's interesting because you bring up the unique identity characteristics, and obviously identity attacks are on the rise, not just at schools, but across the board. There's a lot of data that backs that statement. So in traditional businesses, there's things like multi-factor authentication. You mentioned things like credential stuffing, etc. Are we not forcing users to use, or I'm sorry, not users, but students to use multi-factor authentication in K-12 school districts? And if not, is it because of the age of the kid? I'm just trying to get some kind of better understanding of why they can't do some of those basic things around identity breaches.
Sure. Let's start backwards. Let's talk about students in the sense of K-12, so or pre-K through 12. So these are basically anybody under the age of 18. Students start pre-K sometimes as young as 4. So this is your 4 to 18-year-old, sometimes 19, but we won't go there. Now, if you're talking about a senior in high school, 17, 18, 19 years old, you could probably get them to use some sort of MFA. Now, the question is, you've got a student who can read, who can understand complex passwords. These are almost adults. As a person, they could definitely handle those things. But if you enforce it, you have to ask, well, what is their second factor? You can't force kids to use personal cell phones. Many of the kids don't have personal cell phones. That may be a family decision that they don't want to have that student have a cell phone. They may not be able to afford a cell phone. So you just simply cannot enforce it, even when the students are capable. There are other ways to do it. You could use something like a FIDO token, but then that's a device the student can lose during class or elect to not bring to class intentionally because they don't want to do their work. Again, going back to the hostile user. And then the other way to do it might be a biometric. So it could be something like a fingerprint reader or Windows Hello or some type of device built into a laptop. It's been my experience that school districts can't afford devices that have those features built into them. So you run up against, you can't force the students to use outside equipment. You can't rely on them to own it. You probably can't afford a device with biometric built in. And then that's before you even start talking about the younger students. Again, the younger students can't read. They can't remember passwords that are that complicated. And then that kind of, yeah.
Well, when we're talking about the younger student population, and you definitely bring up some interesting things that I never even thought about, not being able to have a phone or enforce that from a multi-factor authentication. I guess as adults, we just kind of think everybody has one because the day and age we're in. But you mentioned it, right? Certain circumstances, whether parents saying no, that they don't want their kid to have a phone at an early age, or there's financial implications that prevent that. You definitely bring up some things I didn't think about, but you don't really believe that they're focusing on the younger students for going after their identities, because do you really believe, like, I'll say someone from kindergarten through even 6th or 7th grade, they really don't have a lot of access into these systems. So what's the benefit of the attacker to go after these particular identities?
Yeah, that's a good question. So exactly, what does a kindergartner or a second grader have access to that would be detrimental to a cybersecurity situation? And the answer is recon. So I don't believe. I don't know if I don't believe. I definitely haven't seen an attacker target a younger grade versus an older grade. I have seen them target education as broad, but not specifically. I'm going to go pick on a bunch of K through 3rd graders. But what happens is the K through 3rd graders, or the pre-K through 3rd graders, are a little bit more susceptible due to, again, not being able to read and things like that. But what the attacker gets through those is recon. That 3rd grade account can be logged in, open up the address book, do an export. If you're using a device that isn't locked down, so let's say the identity is locked down and somebody's logged in using another computer, they can start exporting out of systems. They can get a list of the kids in the class. They can get a list of the teachers. They can get a list of everybody working at the school district, unless certain precautions are taken. But then those precautions go back to, well, should the student have access to some of those contacts? So should a fifth grader be able to email their principal? That's a school decision. But if the student has a legitimate concern, then why shouldn't they? And I think a lot of educational institutions that I've worked with agree. There's no reason that a student should not be able to access their faculty. But then that goes directly into the recon abilities of the attacker. If the student can see the address book, the GAL, the global address book, or a list of contacts, then that's just more info they can use to level up that attack. They make the foothold, and then the goal is to elevate them to a higher level of access. And recon's the first step of that. So third grader access, definitely give you some recon within the organization.
Right. So just like any kind of cyber attack, I'm assuming schools are using Active Directory some schools are using Active Directory for their identity repository or even Entra ID. So if an attacker is able to exploit an individual account, you mentioned it, right? They can use it for recon to see what's the landscape look like, because by default, especially with Active Directory, any account can read Active Directory and get some pretty good information around the security posture, regardless of if I have only domain user access so they can use that to pivot. So you do bring up a very good point. And it sounds like because of all these things that we typically have in place at a large organization, schools can't do that. So if they can't put in things like multi-factor authentication or enforce multi-factor authentication, there has to be something that they can do to help mitigate this or reduce the effectiveness. Can you shed some light there?
Sure. So enforcing multi-factor is quite difficult. You can still have students opt in. The older kids, especially, basically anybody in high school, probably has a cell phone. They probably have a device that they can multi-factor with. As long as you're not forcing it upon the student, you can still get a pretty high level of opting in. And what I've seen in this regard is that a lot of these kids, let's talk about a fourth or fifth grader. If those kids are playing Fortnite, or those kids have a video game account through Steam or Valve or something like that, they've probably already got multi-factor. And what's funny is maybe 5-6 years ago when multi-factor became more ubiquitous across all systems, if you allow the students to opt in, you'll find that some of these kids opt in at a higher rate than some of the teachers do, because the kids have been playing video games with multi-factor for longer than the teachers have had a multi-factor set up on anything. So you can still make these methods available as long as you're not forcing a student to use an outside device. So that's a good way to do it. Awareness campaigns. Hey, this is available to you. You can download, the Microsoft or the Google or the Duo multi-factor tool on your cell phone. You can opt into it. Here's how you do that. It creates a little bit of a support issue, but in my experience, it's not been high enough to not be worth it. So, for example, you may have frontline tech support doing basic things like resetting passwords. You'll have to train them and build processes for resetting multi-factor devices. Students tend to break their devices more often than adults. So that means students losing cell phones with MFA enrollment. So there's a little bit more MFA resets involved in that regard. But you can still allow the students to opt into MFA. Outside of that, you can use conditional access policies. Those generally work for all population. You can say, they're fine-grained, so just being overly broad. Your students probably work in a geographic area. Maybe they don't need to be logging in from every country in the world. You could do a basic thing like lock all of your student accounts to the country you're living in. or if you can get a little bit more fine-grained, you can prohibit access from certain countries you aren't doing business with. That doesn't seem to disrupt some students or most students, but you also have to think about kids that travel. So in the Southwest of America, there's often travel to and from South America, to and from Mexico. There's also some border states, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, where the granularity of geo-targeting your student may be a little fuzzy. For example, I know that there's some communities in Texas along the Mexican border that actually get their internet from a Mexican provider. So even though they're in America, there's actually a military base down there. I forget the name of it. But even if those students are in America, they may show up as being in Mexico. So as long as you're cognizant about where your students may or may not go, and create a policy for international travel. You've got some foreign exchange students. You've got kids going on trips to other countries as part of extracurricular. As long as those kids have a way to declare that they're leaving the country and make exceptions for your conditional access policies, you can do a pretty good job of locking their geolocation. Those policies are also specific. So you could, for example, say that kids pre-K through 4 should not be leaving the country under any circumstance, or should not be leaving this area under any circumstance, or maybe even they should not be operating outside of your declared network. These are decisions you can make, but you can target these policies to better protect the most vulnerable, the students with the low sophistication in reading passwords and MFA availability.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't think about conditional access policies, but that certainly is. It's something that could enhance an organization's security posture, specifically if you can't do complex passwords or full MFA. What are some other things though that school districts can do to help prevent this, or if they can't prevent it, even recover faster? Is there any advice there?
Yeah, going back to the plan, it's critical that a school district or school has a cybersecurity response plan. And it could be as simple as we're going to contact our IT department. We're going to notify our higher level management at the school district. There may be a county involved. A lot of smaller school districts get services directly from the county that they work with. So, the basic communication plan is like, number one, we have an incident. We've determined it is an incident. These are the 5 people we're going to contact. After that, have a plan. First, are you going to try and fix this yourself, or are you going to involve an outside contractor? Do you even have support for something like this? You identify the resources that you have available to you, and then you decide to engage them in the plan before the incident occurs. In terms of immediate response, assuming that you can get through something like logistics, we talked about the school buses earlier. If you have a plan and you assume that all of your systems are down, and by the way, that plan doesn't necessarily need to be because of a cyber attack. You could have a power outage. You could have an internet outage in your area. A car accident could cause a fiber outage in the region. There are lots of reasons to not have access to your Active Directory or your identity provider or even the internet. So all of the things you require to operate your business, which is education in this case, need to have a fallback plan for when you don't have access to the internet and the computers. So assuming you can get through the logistics of getting kids to school on buses, turning the lights on in classrooms, making sure that the school campuses are safe, things like that. There needs to be a backup lesson plan. When the kids show up, if you were planning on doing something online and the online's not available, you gotta have something in your back pocket. So what I've seen other teachers do, and I'm not a teacher, but what I've seen other teachers do is have like a stretch goal written out on some sort of a paper assignment available for class. So maybe they're studying history and this topic was included in their section, but they don't have time for it in their lesson plan. Well, maybe make the lesson for that have it handy. And then if the students aren't able to use the internet, well, instead of losing time not studying the thing in your lesson plan, you pivot and you've got this new topic that you can talk about offline entirely. You can get through the school day, maybe a couple of school days. So then the students are still receiving relevant education, not just here's some coloring books and let's make the best of the day. They're still going to receive a relevant education. And the day goes on without the technology. So in short, be prepared, have a backup plan, have something ready to teach the students that has value, and just get through the incident.
What about IT folks like yourself? Any advice to the IT folks at in school districts? Because you mentioned plan, obviously plan's key. Is there anything that you would recommend, especially from a recovery perspective, or some other things that they might be able to do outside of the identities themselves, like maybe proactive security measures and anything like that you would recommend?
Yeah, sure. Backups are huge. No school district stands a chance against a dedicated hacking group. Now, putting a lot of the security methods in that will defend you against the casual attacker, the people who are doing drive-bys and hoping for the best, you can get through those. But you're not going to defend yourself against somebody trying to get your info. So if you're a larger school district, we're talking like the Miami-Dades, New York Cities, like millions of students involved. Those are hard targets, and people are going to get out and try to affect those. In that scenario, it's going to be very difficult, maybe even impossible to fully defend yourself against that. So you start talking about recovery. How are you going to recover? You go back to your plan. You start at the base. You're going to need your critical infrastructure, so some sort of physical connection, repair your network. You're going to need identity services restored. You're going to need your directories, like your student information, restored, probably a bunch of databases, things like that. Each one of those disciplines, each one of those sections of IT work need a documented recovery plan, and it needs to be tested. That last little asterisk there, and it needs to be tested, is critical, and a lot of places can't or don't do it. Being able to take every one of those sections and recover it to a known specific point in time, and have backups deep enough to recover at least a couple of weeks, ideally something close to a year, is critical, because you may have had attackers in your network for months and not known it. They could have made their place, created some sort of a recon strategy. They may have even leveled up their attack a couple of steps, and it may have been months before you found it. So being able to restore your systems to any point in time is important on that.
Great insight. Any final words for our audience?
In a lot of cases, you don't have to outrun the bear, as it were. You just need to be better than your peers when it comes to cyber attack, unless you're one of the major targets like the New York, the Miami. If an attacker sees that you've taken major steps to thwart their efforts, sometimes they give up because they're easier targets. There are a lot of targets out there. If you're more difficult than most, some of them might get into that third grader's account, do the recon, be like, this isn't worth it. And they may keep that third grader's account active. But if you're doing things like log analytics or any sort of identity monitoring detection methods, hopefully you find those before they're in the network too long, and you kill them off before they can do any real damage. But in short, if you can do better than your peers, you're probably going to be a less appetizing target, and that's what's worked for most of the school districts I've worked with. We've seen initial attempts, possibly even low-level accounts compromised, but they don't make progress out that because it's just too hard.
Good insight. Well, thanks, Jason, for your deep insight and expertise. If you like this episode of Guardians of the Directory, please be sure to subscribe on your preferred podcast platform. This includes Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and iHeartRadio. Until next time, stay guarded, stay informed, and be the guardian of your directory.